Hey folks, we are live with Mayra Flores, who graciously has agreed to play along on a busy Monday afternoon and get us our dose of poetry, flowetry. Mayra is busy, and from what I know, she's got some life announcements. If she wants to make those, I'll let her make those. This is how Chismen Mitote starts. You kind of start vague hinting stuff, and then you don't fully tell a story, and then you finally tell the story, and everybody's like, that was not what I was expecting. And I'm like, I know. So who's the mitotero? Us or the listener? I don't know. So obviously, I'm in full ham dork mode today. I gave birth on this day 15 years ago. And so if there was anyone I was going to be okay streaming with today, it would be you.
Oh, thank
For
you.
joining us. And if you want to throw down a little bit more about yourself, feel free. I'm going to check our streams really quick while you're doing that. So I am here and present, just doing a tech check because, low budget flow here.
Rosanna, thank you. And it's totally true. I mean, this is the way it happens. And the Cheeseman is just all part of like the flow and the day and what's going on. And I'm sure everyone out there is feeling the same way. It is Monday. I mean, there's that. And a little bit about myself. So I was born and raised in San Jose. My parents are immigrants from Mexico. And we grew up in East Side. A lot of my story started and is revolved around the various flea markets in the area because I literally and figuratively grew up there. So that's for another day. I believe strongly, heavily, very powerfully and passionately about our community and our city. I love it, and I think anyone who has ever met me knows that I am kind of like an unofficial hype woman. If you didn't love San Jose, you will after we have a conversation, because that's just kind of how I am. Very thankful for what the city has given us and what it still has to offer. I am a communicator by day, poet by night. And when I say night, really that means all the time and pretty much in between any time the writing comes to me. I think, Rosanna, you've said it before, poetry happens. And when it needs to be let out, it comes out whether you like it or not. And sometimes when you don't, it comes back in folds, right? Excuse me.
Allergies, they're getting you. They're getting you.
Yeah, my allergies are totally getting to me. And for those that are worried or interested, my vaccination anniversary, I think that's a thing right now, is tomorrow. So I'll be like fully set to go, and I can go out into public without any fear of hurting anyone or hurting myself. So that's great. So I hope, and here's a shameless plug, if you haven't already been vaccinated, get vaccinated. There's nothing but upside. You take care of you and yours, and that's a great thing to do. Let's see, what else? I like to say that I was born a writer. But in true earnest, I began putting pencil to paper. And I say pencil specifically because I love using pencils. And I know people are like, what is going on over there? And I'm like, I like the way it feels. And I like that it allows me the freedom to go, you know what? If it doesn't work, I could just erase it. It's all right. There's nothing permanent to it. And also it allows for flexibility and growth, which is great.
Right.
But truly it was second grade. That was like kind of where that all kind of came about. A little fun side story. A teacher encouraged me to participate in, and I don't know if you guys remember this, but McDonald's used to have a Ronald McDonald's Follow Your Dream contest.
Oh my, I do remember.
And then
I remember. Yeah.
And you would write about what you want to be when you grow up or how you wanted to change the world. So I entered it and I wrote that I wanted to be a teacher, and I want to be a teacher because I wanted to teach so that I can teach people like my parents how to read and write English. And I won second place. So I'm very proud of that. So that was it.
One question: did you get to meet the payaso? Did you get to meet the payaso?
I didn't, because I won the first place. The first place went to someone who wrote about being an astronaut. Apparently, astronauts was really big in the early 90s or the 80s, excuse me.
Yeah, that is true. That's the era. That and singing, some kumbaya type songs out on the blacktop in the hot sun.
Right? Yeah.
that mark for sure. Well, I know that you've collaborated with me in different spaces, mostly through Eastside Magazine, and I think that's how I first really got the pleasure of meeting your poetry. And it's so funny because it's not like we were soliciting poems for a while, but we found that a lot of people vibe in that way, right? And there's something very sincere about it. And there's something about your poems in particular that very much feel like you can feel that cariño for where you are and the people that you live with and in community with. So I appreciate that about you in general, because that is how you show up, right? Beyond your writing and your chicken scratch a lapicero, that is how you show up all the time. And so I'm thankful that you were like, yeah, I'm down, I'll do this. And it was like, all right, because I can collaborate with people on multiple projects, but there's something about sitting with y'all on a Monday to have this plática that gets me thinking about, not just why do we write, but why do we exist poetically, and why that's so damn important, especially for the times. And it's timeless, really.
And Rosanna, I love, love, love the fact that you do this. I appreciate it. I appreciate that you're creating this space and you're normalizing it, right? You are normalizing poetry in every form that it comes in. I find, I mentioned I've written pretty much all my life. I've never felt like I was a poet or like I owned those titles that are out there. When I think of poems and poetry and poets, like I think like way up there, oh man, like they're out there honing their craft and they, write and rewrite. But I have inadvertently created like this binary of what a poet is and what poetry looks like, right, even though I feel it different. You feel it different. And I started seeing and being exposed to it. And quite frankly, my process is it comes out, right? And I have to feel it. I can't force it because when it comes out forced, it looks forced. Like you look at it and go, oh, God, that's crappy. Well, I don't know. No, scratch that. I'm going to use my eraser on that one.
Ma, that's a bunch of one-liners for later. That's not going to be anything right now. Yep. You can't force the love for the words. The words got to kind of find you in that way. And what's funny is this, I think, was a long time in the making without me even knowing, because there's poets that we have our day jobs and our night jobs and sometimes our 20 side hustles. And there will be years that you'll be interacting with people. And then all of a sudden, you feel compelled to share a poem and it hits, a friend or a colleague. And they're like, wait, what? You write poems? And I'm like, I have been for a really long time. And there's something about having conversations with a lot of my friends who have all of these, stacks of notebooks where you write poetically. And some people embrace that and they'll say, yeah, I identify as a poet, or I've been identified as a poet. And so now, sure, I'll claim it, right? That's kind of how it happened with me. But a lot of folks are like, I'm just so-and-so from, like, for example, Salvador, who was the kickoff to this series. And we had talked, a few people in danza specifically, about how, oh, we should do like a open mic, but at home, right? At home, that you could just kind of come to. And we were messing around with this idea of living room poets. And so, the universe don't play. And so I think it's interesting to see the poetry of that, because I'm talking to a lot of you, from your living rooms, from your homes, in a time that I could have never have planned to have this be a part of our collective story. And I'm so grateful that people help me kick off my week, because it sets the tone for me for purely selfish reasons. Whoever's, streaming along or catches it on the replay, I'm hoping that you get a little bit of something for you. But for me, it's purely selfish, right? I'm like, hell yes, I get to hang out with people. It's like having cafecito with poetry. Today I have water, but whatever. We could pretend it's a cafecito.
You know what? And I agree. I think it's one of those things, and I feel like sometimes it's a cliche, but it's truth, right? That silver lining of what this pandemic has done, by forcing us to go virtual and not to be able to sit in community and have that cup of coffee in person anymore. It also has opened the doors to be able to see these other facets, to people, and particularly, the poetry that they live and breathe, that they write. I always think of it and picture it as like seeing a person in so many colors, and you find out, oh man, you're a writer too. You do this, you do that. It's like they come to life in a different color, right? And they bring some like energy on like that's completely different. I know you alluded earlier to about my changes in status and whatnot. So I'm a professional communicator. I work for a supervisor at the county, and recently I was promoted, and today is my first day in my new role as the chief of staff for Supervisor Susan Ellenberg. And the only reason why I bring that up is because, the interactions and interfaces that I have with a lot of people, it's in that capacity, and being able to communicate the story between entities to our community, to the public. And last month, was it last month, April? Yes. During National Poetry Month, I decided just on a whim, I'm going to write a poem a day, see how far I could take it, see if I could stick with it. And I was writing this poetry, and I'm like, why am I writing it in a notebook? No one's going to see it. I'm never going to do anything with it. How is that accountable? Or how is that even contributing to anything? So I started posting it online, and a lot of people that know me in this other capacity, they're like, oh man, I had no idea.
Right.
You write poetry too? Man, so do I.
That is my favorite part. The so do I, right? And so there's something beautiful about sharing and kind of enabling and encouraging that simply by just putting a poem a day out there, even if it's only for April, or even if it's random poems throughout the year. There's something about them that they will reach who they need to reach in their time. And there's some kind of weird faith about that. But I'm like, I'm here for it because I've seen it throughout the years, right? And we've experienced it. And I think part of this connection with you in that way is also along those lines. And folks who, we might connect with in the course of the work that we do, it adds like a different flavor to things. And for me, I always feel like poets are very truthful and sincere. And because words have a way with us, a lot of times people say, you have a way with words. I'm like, no, words have a way with me, good, bad, and the ugly. They will have their way. And sometimes we're the messengers. A lot of the times is how I feel it. And we're paying attention, right? And we're kind of translating the moment. And if it sounds pretty, great. If it sounds angry, pues toma, because someone needed to hear it because it needed to be said. And, and here we are. And I'm looking forward to seeing, I love to binge watch anything really. And I'm already like pre-party planning for myself. I'm like, I'm going to binge watch these like later and see how they morph in terms of what they say on the replay. And so I love that we're also leaving kind of this poetic archive, because another frustration of mine has always been, when folks are looking for poets and they'll be like, well, we couldn't find a Latina poet or a poet of color or a poet from San Jose or a poet from the Bay Area. And I'm like, well, mira nomás. There's an archive here. There are plenty of us emerging, sometimes from our living rooms and sometimes writing 4:00 in the morning, not my style. Sometimes writing at midnight, sometimes my style. Sometimes stealing a break midday, right? Pulling over on the side of the road. So I know you mentioned your poems kind of found you early on, and that was always kind of like you were born a writer. What's your process? Like, are you one of those, like, by any means necessary, a poem comes to me when it comes to me, and if I'm driving, I'm pulling over, or I know that sounds odd for people who haven't been listening along, but it is a thing.
It is a thing. And quite frankly, that is probably the closest description to what my process is. It does. It comes to me. I'll share this. Last year, I was taking a pandemic road trip to the desert with my kid. We do it every year. And we were going up the Tehapachi mountains. And you know, I was driving and I look over and I see this scene and something hits me and I immediately am like, oh my God, I'm stuck. I can't go anywhere. I have to write it. And so I was telling my kid, I was like, oh my God, can you please put like voice notes on? Because I need to tell you something so that I can have it to write down later. But it was just, it's that urgency, right? It comes to you when it comes to you, something sparks something. And that's kind of, you know, the majority of my process. I would say the other side to that is also very contemplative. I like to be able to, I always joke, I like to hone in my old lady style. I sit in the morning, I have a rocking chair outside, and I have my cafecito, and it's quiet, and I just listen and I look, and sometimes it's in those moments of quiet that that poetry comes to you, because you're seeing everything in a completely different light, and you're almost removing yourself by staying quiet, which, if anybody, and I'm sure a lot of people who know me, it's very hard for me. I'm a verbose person. I talk a lot. So that quiet also aids in that creation.
Awesome. Well, when you're ready to throw down a poem or two, I would love to hear it. And I'm sure, you know, folks hearing along either live or on the replay would love to hear a little bit of flavor of what your poetry flows like.
All right. I'll start with this one. This one, and speaking of the desert, I actually wrote this when I was in Joshua Tree. So the title is Trembling Hands. I wrote a letter today, the first in a long time, so long that I cannot remember the last. I used a pencil, my favorite instrument, because the feel of the lead against the paper calms me. I tried to write in cursive, but my hand trembled as it rushed across the page. My mind urged it to slow down, to remember the loops and curls and sweeps of the letters. But each word had to be rewritten because my hand pressed on, unfazed by my mind. Is this what life has embedded in my muscle memory? Fast, quick, finish. I put down my pencil, slowed my breath, closed my eyes, tried picturing the writing in my heart, urging my hand once again to release it to the page, slowly.
And slowly, just like the cadence of that poem, right? And there's a beauty to hearing folks. I don't even know if recite is the right word, but you know, as close as that's going to get. You're breathing life into your poetry by reading it out loud. And there is something about hearing the cadence and the rhythm and the softness or the harshness, right, of how poems were intended by the person who gets the joy of writing them. And you know, when you pick it up in writing, you don't always read it the same way. And I think there's a beauty in that too. But there's something about hearing you know, having authored that to just give it this really smooth, very like, it's almost like, oh yeah, I think I was in that rocking chair with you for a quick 30 seconds, right? Let my mind wander and be there. So they feel like a meditation in some ways.
You know, I appreciate that, because I feel like word breaks and paragraphs are just not enough when you're writing to convey it the way you hear it in your mind. So I greatly appreciate hearing other writers read their work, because when you hear it, it's like, that's how it came to them.
Right. Right. And there's something about how we play with words también, right? Like you can mess around with syllables all day and it gives it a different life, you know? And it gives it like it kind of becomes its own little song. And I know that sounds like corny to some people who are like, girl, this is why I don't do poetry. And I'm like, yes, you do. You just call it other stuff. Right. But there's something about the pace that this, you know, region has morphed into, that when you hear something kind of calling on you to slow down, it has extra layers of value, right? Like slow the hell down. We're all in chinga all the time. And, you know, we reclaim chingonanes And we've kind of embraced this idea that we're always going to be in chinga. And I'm like, well, we can be chingona and slow the hell down sometimes. We can be chingona and take a rest and take a breath and sit in that rocking chair and sip your coffee. Like, there's something that's so beautiful about that. So,
It truly is. And we don't have enough of it. I used to laugh because my parents, when we were growing up, we always, and even now, we always take time to have a cafecito. And you know how a cafecito turns into another cafecito, and then there's it just like keeps going, and before you know it, you're like, okay, I'm not gonna be able to sleep because I drank too much cafecito, right? But those moments of being able to just sit with other people and have a cup of coffee, and like that, it feels restorative. And it feels, and I'm having one of those moments where my words escape me. Of course,
they want to find you. Oh yeah,
words. But it feels almost like oh God, what's the word? I'm having an issue here.
I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, but I'm like, oh my God, I have to, because this I think is part of the work of a poet. Is there is something about being able to linger with the word that's not quite right, or giving it time for that word that's like right there. That damn word is right there, but there's something about sitting there either with your pencil, or I've taken to sometimes even being this digital poet warrior of sorts, because I save everything in my freaking Google Drive, and I'm like, hold on, that's not the right word. And my kids know this because we'll be out on the porch and they're like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm waiting for the word to find me, because I know what I'm trying to say, but the word that I've landed on isn't the one. And they're like, okay. So it's cute because now as a household, they'll try to offer, like, how about this? And I'm like, no, it's not, that's not the one. How about that? No, nope, that's not the one, and it's something about that reminds me of like, cuando tienes un antojo, right? Like, and you're like, I don't know exactly what I'm looking for, but I know when I find it, that's what it was, right? And I feel like other folks who write, they're like, yes, I totally get that, And there's something about the value of that again, because in your spaces at work, it's like, we don't have time to wait for the words to find you. And it's like, no. And that's why when I write at work, it's very different from when I sit down to be like, all right, right now I'm writing my story as I see fit. And I think people forget that that's a part of the process. So I love that right now you're like, nah. Because here we are.
I'm so glad to hear that, Rosanna. I wish I had someone like yelling at me, how about this? How about this? Because I'd be like, you keep going. I think we're closer. And I know exactly what the word is that I'm wanting, and it just isn't coming to me right now. So when we come back, I promise you, I will bring it back and be like, oh, this is what.
Oh yeah, it's got the thread of your brain for now, and it's like winding itself. I totally know that vibe. But speaking of words, the pacing with which you want to share your poems, you could be like, oh no, slow down. I'm not ready for number 2 yet, because there's also room for each poem to breathe. And so I know we kind of jumped into the cadence of your first poem, and we didn't talk a whole lot about like, okay, well, what inspired that poem? Like, how did that one come to you? What does it morph in what it means after you've written it down and reshared it? And I'm curious because sometimes when you write a poem and you read a poem and then you go to share a poem with another audience, it does for quite a few of us morph and shift and kind of transform in meaning. So I don't know if that's the case for you too, but I'm curious to hear.
I already made adjustments to it as we were chatting, because I found ways that were better in terms of the way they was broken, for the various sentences to make it flow closer to what I actually recited, I guess. Because I don't know if this happens to you, but sometimes I'll write something in a certain way, but when I read it differently. And I don't know if it's because I just don't want to read something. I want to be able to feel it, or if it's because this is actually the way it should have been written to begin with.
Yeah, I've moved lines in a poem and I'm like, no. So I kind of remember next time how to cue myself, right? There's a difference there.
Yeah, so I made changes there. And in terms of the process for that one, I was, we spent a week in Joshua Tree in an Airbnb so that we didn't have to commingle with anybody. And it was like this little casita. And every morning I'd have my coffee in the little in the patio. And I decided 2 days in that I wanted to write letters of gratitude to people that have made this pandemic tolerable. and it was on a whim, and so I started writing. I literally started writing letters, and cursive is kind of my go-to because that's how I was trained. And I was so incredibly frustrated and angry at the entire process because I kept like having to basically, instead of spending 5 minutes on a letter, I spent like 20 because I had to keep rewriting it because I was messing it up. I was going too fast, which of course spurred that poem, because I'm like, really?
Oh, damn.
Is this where we're at, where we speed everything, including something so basic like putting pen to paper? And I was like, it can't just be me.
I guarantee you it's not just you. Yeah. Well, when you're ready for poem 2 to strike,
sure,
so I can hit the little production switches over here accordingly.
All right. Let's go ahead and jump to the next one then.
All right.
This one is California Poppy. Persistence, patience, penchant for pigheadedness, breaking boxes, avoiding domestication, wild, pushing past traditional beds, peeking through breaks in the ground, phenomenally plain, extraordinarily photogenic, pure.
Short, sweet, direct. I know for sure what stood out to me was that box, and suddenly I thought about freedom and this phenomenal sense of freedom. And I think there's something ultimately free in choosing to write in poetic form, because it kind of defies all form, right? Like, yeah, you can study it and there's forms and structure, and but then there's also like, you get to dictate what that looks like, in ultimate freedom. And that is kind of what that triggered for me. But I know, your intentionality behind it. And sometimes there's like hopes and aspirations we have for certain pieces. And I know there's always a backstory. Like, people tend to remember, oh, I wrote this poem when, or it felt so urgent in this way. And that one, kind of, it was short and it hit in a different way from how the other slower, like this one, for some reason, fuels in me this sense of free urgency. And I don't know if that makes sense, to folks listening, but it makes complete sense to me.
You're not
the poem that's going to want to find me, right? Based on that.
So fun little side story. So my favorite flower is the California poppy for lots of different reasons. But I have a garden and I tried to grow them for nearly a decade. And like nothing, nada ni uno, like zero. I'm like, for reals, guys? Like you literally like grow everywhere in this state, but you won't grow here. Like, oh man, I took it almost personally. Like it was like, ha, not for you.
Right.
And last year, I decided on a whim. I was like, you know what? I was like, it's been 10 years. I'm gonna try. Just see what happens. And I sprinkled them in the front yard. And I ended up getting some. I had like 6 plants total, 6 plants. And I was like, oh man, I can't believe this is happening. But to me, it was just like that pig-headedness, right? Like, no, I'm not going to grow for you. I'm going to grow whenever I want to grow, and I'm going to do it in my time, and it's not your timetable. And just because you think it, it's like, no, like you think you have control, but you really don't. And it was just kind of a really stark, like, reminder for me that, we we can want and will, but Mother Nature is not. And not to sound too corny or cheesy here, but she comes on her own time,
Yeah.
and and plants are the same way. And I think, and I don't think I'm alone in this, but this pandemic has really kind of brought to the front and stage people's desires to nurture and to grow, and
Right.
see this with the plants and plant parents taking off everywhere. And it was just a nice reminder that, just we don't control it. And when they do decide to bless you with their presence, that it's a gift, and to enjoy, like truly enjoy it.
I can vibe with that because sometimes I'm like, I am Rosanna the great and powerful, and even the plants bow down to me. But really, what they're saying is like, no, no, not right now, not here, And I will be like, but I Googled, how to take care of this particular plant. And everybody be like, no. And for a while, things like Yerba Buena is like, are you serious? That grows by itself. And I'm like, well, not here, And then when it does, right? And there's something about that. When it does, it does. I know there's a phrase that we jokingly say, and it's kind of this inside joke, so I won't explain it too much, but it's like that whole idea of el maíz crece cuando el maíz crece, right? Like, yes, the maíz is going to grow when it's going to grow. And we don't control it. And you're right? We don't control it. And we have absorbed a lot of ideas in our society that if we can just control all of the things, it will yield X, Y, and Z results. That's not the case in life, right? Like you can plan your entire life and there's going to be a plot twist here and there, or 5 or 12. And there's something about flow. And there's something about coming to a space of flow as a practice. And I'm not quite there yet, but I know it's calling me. So the plants are having a better time. Not completely in my care, but they are, allowing me to be like, okay, we'll give you we'll throw you a few just for now. But we don't control it. And there are so many things that we're, in spite of our idea that we know all the things or can search all the things or scientifically distill all the things, it's not the case. Not the case.
It truly isn't. And it's very humbling too. It truly is that moment where you're like, it doesn't matter. I followed exactly what Google told me. I followed exactly that YouTuber. He's lying. Like,
what was the inside scoop? Where did they switch the seeds for the other plant? Because that's not how it went. Yeah.
Yep. And truly, it also, at least for myself, it makes me appreciate it more when it does turn out and when it works out, and when I have like a mini poppy field right now in my yard, which I am incredibly grateful for and look at and enjoy every day. I don't know if I would enjoy it as much if it had come to me immediately when I wanted it.
Yeah, there's something to be said about that, right? For sure.
Yep. So
that's one of the things.
Mother.
Yeah. So he's like, your green thumb? I don't know. I lost it, Ironically, I'm like, I come from a family lineage of folks who can make things grow. And for some reason, it skipped me and my mom. So it'll
yeah. Oh, yeah. I hear
on blast. She's like, why are you telling people I kill plants? I'm like, Mom, because we both do. It'll be fine.
One of the ways that my mother and I and my sister, I have one sister, have been able to stay in contact and in community even during the times where we're sheltering in place to keep everyone safe. We would send photos. We have a text thread. My mom is on text now, so she's super excited. and she'll be like, "Mija, mira mis flores. Look at what I got." And then it was like great in the beginning, and then it felt like almost like, "Oh yeah, what did I got? Oh yeah," and then they'd be like, "Mayra, what's going on? What's going on with your yard that's all dead? Like your sister's doing this, and I have this, and then it turned into a plant exchange, and then oh man, yeah, it has been so interesting in the way that this has come to life and brought us all together."
Right. No joke. In fairness to my mother, she can keep orchids alive, and I think that's a skill. So
That is.
and that's the thing, right? There's different plants for all of us. And I think to run parallel to the poetry, I'm one of those firm believers that like there are some of us who embrace this way of being and writing and translating in the world. But I feel like everybody is kind of born a poet. And you can always choose to reclaim or recover it. The trick is if you're looking for someone else to validate that, you're setting yourself up, right? And that's the thing. It's there are so many markers of validation for all the things that a lot of times it's well, what internal work are we doing to come to terms with how we want to exist in the world, right? And I'm like, if you want to write and call them poems, go ahead, right? Like we were forced to read some pretty, from what I thought, mediocre poems and some great poems that I just didn't relate to. There's a combination of things.
Sure.
Who gets to hype those things up, right? Is always like a power dynamic for sure. And so it's like in a lot of ways, I'm like, you want to rebel, write a freaking poem. You know, what is that going to do? It's going to defy a whole lot of things, including whether or not, you know, folks think we have the right or the audacity to sit down and play with words. Like that feels like revolution in a lot of ways for how we're contextualized.
Hands down. Hands down. I completely agree. And I think most people don't realize that they have this power of words and poetry. And I think, you know, going back to what I had mentioned earlier, is just this binary that we've created that only it has to be this
Right.
to exist. It has to be this to be that. And it doesn't. And it's pretty fantastic and freeing when you see people just, you know, live their poetry and embrace the one line for later, right?
That one line can turn into an epic poem. It has. Like I have been set off by people on stage giving empowering speeches. And it doesn't like I might be in the mood that day, but like all of a sudden it'll turn into a whole damn poem. And I'm over there like little Kermit the Frog with my like and aquí estamos, you know, la matraca of the typewriter, like in modern form, right? I have a typewriter, it doesn't work. And so it's like there's something about untangling our everyday. And sometimes that means we're recalibrating, remembering to breathe, take a pause, rock in that chair, noticing nature while we're driving, you know, writing some tender thoughts to our friends. Like poetry is so many things. And I do want to make sure that we have time for you to share your third one. And I also have a very like selfish question that I wanted to ask you about, you know, your growing upness with the pulga in mind. And I know we've talked about your parents before and that entrepreneurship. And so I'm not saying they're related, but I'm saying they're probably connected in that way.
So why don't we start with that, because I actually think this conversation is going to lend itself very well to that third poem.
I love it. So you shared a few things, right? Including for a while, it was here's some awareness over what's happening with the pulga. Here's the importance of the pulga and what that means for a lot of people in our stories. And then it kind of morphed into this chat about entrepreneurship, right? And like kind of learning this hustle. And I think when we say hustle, certain nuanced layers get lost about like the intergenerational pieces. But I'm always like, well, my hustle is attached to how I witnessed and saw my dad, my mom, my grandparents. You know, my grandma used to take stuff and sell at the pulga, and she would love to have yard sales, and we would go with her, right? And it would be the pulga out in Morgan Hill. The train depot, I think, is what it is now. You know, like there's always like layered stories to that. And people have written songs about that, right? And we have like this idea that hustle and entrepreneurship looks like a distilled Instagram fancy looking page set to some very, muted tones. And I'm like, no, to me, it's a vibrant. It looks like my family. It looks like calloused hands, So I don't know where that takes you, but.
So my dad would always tell me, honest work is honest work, and that's all that matters. And that was so true, because to me that went hand in hand with the idea in term of hustling for my community, right? For our community. And so when we were kids, so my parents were undocumented when they came to this country. They got their legal residency through the amnesty that was passed by Ronald Reagan. And after that, a lot of things opened up for them, but a lot of things didn't change. And my dad, so he had a college education from his hometown in Jalpa, Zacatecas. And he came here and found out that because he didn't speak the language, because his school was not accredited here, he'd have to do it all over again. And he's like, con qué tiempo? It's like, how am I supposed to do that and take care of myself? He's like, so he started washing cars for a living, and he worked at the auto dealers over on Stevens Creek Boulevard. And that's how he made his living. He washed cars. During that time, though, there was a lot of ICE raids. So what a lot of those places would do is they would just like lay everybody off and then rehire them and lay it. So it was very unstable work. And my mom at that time, she was working in tech, as we know tech, right? She was a machine operator for a floppy disk company in Email. And so they decided very early on, they're like, you know what, like this is a stable job, yours is not, like, let's try to figure something out. And my dad just went back to his roots, which were business and hustling. My grandfather had a fruteria, a fruit stand in his hometown, and that's how they made their living. It was huge, and it's still running by one of my tios. And my dad was like, you know what? That's what we're gonna do. I'm sure there's gonna be a tianguis here. Like that, I'll take a look. And we started vending. We started vending at the Capitol Flea Market and at the Berryessa Flea Market. And every weekend, my sister and I would pile into the van, and we would drive over to the flea market, and we'd set up shop, and my dad would sell various wares, and that's what we did. And we grew up there, and it was such a feeling of family and community because everyone else there was doing the same thing.
Right.
And everyone there was helping each other out. Everyone there was just doing, as my dad said, honest work to be able to provide for their families.
Mm.
And these were generations of people, lots of people. And there were no Saturday morning cartoons for us, because we were Saturday mornings at the flea markets working and helping our parents and watching our parents do that. And unbeknownst to us, being instilled with this sense of being able to be self-sufficient and understanding how you fit in place with your community and how you help each other out to lift each other up, and the power, the transformative power of being able to run your own hustle to be able to provide for those that you care about. So I grew up there. I had a lot of my my first there. I learned to drive at the Capitol Flea Market. I mean, I'm not kidding you. That when I say I grew up there, I literally grew up there. And to me, it's just one of those near and dears, because I saw what it did, not just for my family, but for all of the countless families that were there doing exactly the same thing, doing an honest living to be able to provide for their families in a way that helped the community. Because truly what we're talking about is an enterprise that helps our community, because it's run by our community, which, is a double-edged sword. Those of us that are involved and know about it and benefit from it understand intimately the importance of it.
Right.
And those that don't, maybe just don't have that grasp of how important and how interconnected everything is. I still go regularly. My parents do too, and they still know everyone. And now their kids are all running things, and they've done little tweaks and have modernized and whatnot. And a lot of yeah, a lot of the kids that were out there on the Saturday mornings with me when I was like 10. Now they have their kids and they're running things there too, and it's just, that story to me is the story of an economic engine here that no one really understands its value and its impact. So
Yeah.
it's part of why I have become very vocal about the importance of really understanding the value. It's not just like in terms of the San Jose flea market, it's not just the 750 vendors.
Right.
It's every single one of those people's families. It's every person that they employ. It's all of the community that they help support. We are talking about a ripple effect in our community. And that, if that doesn't bring urgency, I don't know.
Right.
So on that note, I will share my last poem with you today.
Okay.
And it's entitled East Side. I am the struggle. I am the heartache, the headache. I am the success, the joy, the celebration. I am the color, so dark, so deep, provocatively showing up, showing out, standing proud. I am the sacrifice of so many immigrants, of mothers, of fathers, of abuelitas and ninos. I am the fruit of their labor, their laughter, their tears. I am everything that makes you love us, fear us, envy, and deny us. I am.
There's such great power in that declaration of I am. For you to end there, it's that affirmation, right? And there's something powerful beyond the words that are going to find me right now about that particular poem on the heels of the conversation that we were just having about community and what other people would call micro enterprise, but indeed it's a lot more than micro for sure. I think the micro is the perception rather than the thing itself. And there's something about, you ended with I am, and I don't know if it was a reflex or what, but I was like, me too, or we are, right? Like it took me there to that connection. And even when you were talking about the pulga, right? We frequented the pulga, like we hopped. It was Berryessa and Capital. Like we did not discriminate. And there was something about the familiarity that you would get with vendors there, and something about something really reassuring about knowing, okay, when you go down this aisle, you're going to see these 3 booths that you're always going to go to. And so much so that like, some of the vendors by name, right? And it's a reinforcement of like the people power in all of that. And it takes me back to the piece of the conversation where you were like, all of these unspoken, unacknowledged ripple effects. There's something magical about the way you brought that poem together. And there's some power in these shorter poems, right? Because I felt like it wasn't short, but there was something just so full in the amount of space that I'm sure it takes up in a page,
I do. Sorry. I'm like, Fiona, stop trying. Just stop crying. I'm like having a moment here. But it's and I think when I was putting that down, it wasn't just for me. It was for every one of me that is out there, right? Sorry. It's, yeah.
And I think there's right now there's I don't want to call it a misguided urgency, but I think we've started thinking about there is a lot of beautiful development in the Bay Area flea market for sure. And then at the same time, that can't come at the expense of folks who have been there, across generations, who might be looked at, well, that's just a little puesto that has chucherias. You know what? The reason they have that puesto with chucherias is because there are people who want it. And there are people who, in some aspects, need it, right? For whatever reason. Like, for as much as I don't frequent the pulga as much as I would like in today's time, I am that person who's always scouring for little gems and treasures, and I am not about that minimal life, obviously. And I'm like, there's something about the stories that you get to hold in your hands by way of somebody's old teacup or whatever, right? And who gets to say who has access to the sale of that and who has access to the finding of that. And the pulga just felt like an equalizing space in that sense, because you weren't going to an antique shop, and there's a lot to unpack there, right? But there's a lot to unpack around the everyday just connection that those spaces provide. And so, hearing your story and getting it in little glimpses, because I feel like there's still a whole lot, right? And it's like I'm getting little glimpses, and there is something beyond deeply personal. There's just something so impactful about it. And for someone to take the time and be like, I noticed what my parents were doing, and I noticed what these families are doing, and there's significance there. I think truly, in a lot of ways, that's the urgency behind being a poet, right? Is that we get to tinker with the words to find those sentiments that connect us in some ways to the urgency of very life-altering decisions made at a policy level. And so when people are like, oh, you're a poet, you're like, what, free flowing hippie? And I'm like, no, I am a pretty fierce advocate of sorts. If I want to call myself that on any given day is another issue. But, there is an activism there that I feel has run constant with each person that has showed up to play along with me on a Monday. And so I thank you for sharing your combination of poems and a little bit about your family story with me. And I think there's connection, right? Ongoing connection.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And again, Rosanna, the space that you provide here on a Monday to set the tone for the week is incredibly valuable to everybody. So thank you for having me here.
And for folks who are curious to connect with you beyond this hour here, if you want to provide them little trails of where to follow you or connect with you, feel free. Where to find your poems and poetry, or if they just want to connect with you along the lines of, family, entrepreneurship, and advocacy, where might folks do that, or how might folks connect with you in that way?
They can look me up at Mayra Flores 408 on most of the social media channels. You can find me there. I have different bits and pieces. I'm an open book. I don't have anything private. I believe that once you're online, you're online. There's no. I was like, there's no.
I have two separate ones, not because one's private and one's not. But I think like some people are like, "Girl, I don't care about your kids," and I'm like, "Well, I do, obviously." And if you try to follow me on that one, that's what you're gonna get. So.
Exactly. I was like, yeah. For myself, I'm like, you know what? I don't modify myself. If you like it, great. If you don't have to follow.
Mayra Flores 408.
Mayra Flores 408. Yeah. And I'm more than happy to provide an email or a link or whatever afterwards, like in the comment section, if anyone is curious. Currently my poetry does not live anywhere besides with me.
Fair. And I think that's a beautiful thing, right? A lot of us might be dissuaded by that. And I'm like, I'm not. It gets to who it needs to get to in its time, however the poet sees fit. And there's something empowering about that I value wholeheartedly. And with that, folks, I know Mayra has a lot of stuff to do with her fancy new job. That's, an extension of her fancy old job. And if you want to play along on another Monday, I'll be here again on the 24th. And we do have another poet lined up. So, follow along, whether it be on YouTube or Facebook, and you'll get a glimpse and peep who's coming up next. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Adiós. Gracias.